Okay, so we are in chapter 6 after being off last week, and this is the longest chapter in John and quite a bit of content to cover. Uh, Fortunately, it's a consistent topic. There's like a little interjection in there, but I think you'll find that it starts off with the story of the feeding of the 5,000. And the central theme of that is the bread and the loaves and the fishes and the feeding of the masses. And there's a symbolism behind it that then leads into his message to the crowd. That's the latter half of the chapter. Once he feeds them one day, then when they come back the second day, he says, I know you're not here because of the wonders and the things that I said. You're here because I fed you. And then launches into what is the turning point of his ministry, which is the statement about being the bread of life. And he draws the line in the sand in chapter 6. This is actually halfway through the ministry, towards the latter half. It's just, as we said, the book of John is not linear like the rest of like Matthew, Mark, and Luke. It's not in story form, and so it feels choppy, but we're really getting into the latter half of his ministry. And this is where it's delineated in each one of the Gospels. He starts drawing a very hard line between those who are with him and those who are not, those who are willing to be radical in their faith and those who are following for the theatrics of it, for the hope that he would overthrow the governments and really the wrong reasons, not the heart behind the Messiah, but the result of the Messiah that they were looking for. And so his message from here on out starts getting a little more cut and dry, a little more divisive, and you're going to see he even sort of challenges the disciples towards the end of this chapter, but there's a central theme of it that makes it so you kind of have to take it all together. So please help me try to avoid tangents this week, because this is going to be quite a bit of content to get through in obviously under an hour, as always. So I will jump into it, and I kind of cut out the summary or the review from last week a bit, so that I can add this concept that we've been building up to and talk about what does it mean to believe, and what is it, we talk a lot about if you believe in Jesus, how do you know? We've already seen many examples of they believed, but they believe in vain, or they believed, but he did not commit himself to them. He's very clearly trying to delineate belief and variations on. There's some threshold that I can't tell you when you've tipped it over, but he knows, and it's real. And as it says in Paul says on numerous occasions, I think at 3 different occasions, even the devils believe in who he is. Even the devils admit that he's the Son of God. But it's not belief unto salvation. It's not belief that then translates into faith and therefore is saving faith. And so we're going to talk a little bit about how does that is the definition of a devotional issue that should be a fundamental part of your Bible study is wrestling with this idea of, Lord, give me the kind of belief and the kind of belief that allows you to instill your faith, the faith that you put in me, and being open to that and being conscious of the fact that you can believe something but not believe on it, not put your trust in it. You can acknowledge something to be true but not go so far as to say I'm betting everything on this, and making sure that we find ourselves as far on that side of the spectrum as possible. And I think that's the fundamental concept of the book of John, and so we're going to talk about that a bit in chapter 6 of our 7-7-7 structure. We're going to see the first of the I am statements. I am the bread of life, the first statement made by Christ identifying, and the third of the 7 miracles, the feeding of the crowd, feeding of the 5,000. Again, this is more just for tracking and outline purposes. But this is the part I'm really wanting to get into before we actually launch into the study. As we've talked about many times, John gives us the reason why he wrote his gospel. What the overall theme of everything in this book is Jesus did many other things in the presence of his disciples which are not written in this book, but these are written that you might believe that Jesus Christ is the Son of the living of God, and that believing you may have life in his name. And so everything in this gospel is along that track, is to that end. And you will find that he uses the word believe 98 times in 21 chapters. That's more than 98 times, is more than every one of Matthew, Mark, and Luke combined. And once you start seeing that, it forces this idea of, okay, I mean, we see several verses that appear to be exactly the same. Like, right, we see, most surely I say to you, he who believes in me has everlasting life. For God so loved the world that he gave his begotten Son, that whoever believes in him should not perish but have everlasting life. He who hears my word and believes in him who sent me has everlasting life and shall not come into judgment, but has passed from life into death. And you kind of have to wrestle with the idea of, is this just repetition? Is this just emphasis? Is this just saying the same things over and over and over so they get into your mind? Or is there something else that's trying to be communicated? Is there a teaching mechanism that goes into this? And I want to, now that we're sort of in the midst of it, we've seen how John's using these to build a case for belief, to build a case that Christ is who he says he is, that he is the Son of God. And we're going to continue to see throughout this book, here is a reason you should believe. Here is another reason you should believe. Here is a reason you should believe. And each time we run into that, we want to be disciplined in saying, what is it that constitutes belief in this case? Is this a positive example of belief unto faith and salvation? Is this a negative example of belief that isn't regenerative, belief that many believed in him after the casting out after the cleansing of the temple? It says many in Israel saw his signs and believed in him, but he did not commit himself to them because he knew their hearts. So, okay, is this an example of negative belief? If so, what was going on that classified that belief? I think wrestling with that idea of why it's necessary that the Holy Spirit felt needed to write an entire book around this basis of establishing belief. I mean, John 3:16 would have been enough. And if he didn't want you wrestling with this idea of what is belief that leads to faith, do you not think that the God of the universe could have triggered something inside you that's a light that comes on as soon as you've got that justifying belief that allows him to put his faith in you? It is a matter of pursuit. Everything that throughout the Bible, you're going to find that the God of the universe wants to be pursued by you. The weirdest concept ever, these quislings that crawled out of the dust and then spit in his face and continue to do so daily. He wants you to seek after him. He wants you to be searching for his heart, to, in prayer and meditation, ask him for the belief. Ask him to be real on a daily basis. Ask him to be renewing himself in you. It's a dynamic thing, and it's not otherwise. We're talking about your creator. If he wanted it to be pass-fail, he could have said it once. For God so loved the world that whoever believes in him, and by the way, you'll know when you have that belief because there'll be a slight ticking in your heart that's a little different than it was before, and then you're good to go. It's not what happens. It's this constant, lifelong assertion. The belief is once and for all that establishes faith, but it's a pursuit. You have to pursue him to get that. It's not I saw a sign. I saw one thing that happened. I acknowledge that he is who he says he is, and now it's locked in. And I don't know where that line is. It might happen that way for some people, but it just seems that there's more here. And so I'll get in a second here. I raise it just because I want to encourage you to wrestle with it for you personally, to just be satisfied in your heart that you have whatever it is that constitutes belief and not just assent that he is who he is. Yep.
What you're saying reminds me of a study that I did over a number of months on the dynamics of presence. How we are affected by various presents in our life. And I remember as a kid when I walked into a classroom at the beginning of each year, I wanted to know, is the teacher for me or against me? You know, kind of bottom line, I needed to know that. Not that I ever And I came to the conclusion that we really can't be indifferent, for, against, or indifferent, because indifference is not felt like for. You know, if a teacher was indifferent, I didn't feel like I had their support. You know, you see what I'm saying? And
Yeah.
I think to say that Jesus is the Son of God can be head knowledge, but
Right.
he wants us to say it with our hearts.
And I think that's where, for some people, it may happen like that. It may happen in that first encounter with him, and we've got examples here. We've got examples throughout John that he calls out where there were people, like the woman at the well, where it seems that he's indicating that happened immediately. And then there's people that have exposure to him and have conversations with him, like Nicodemus, where it says it doesn't result in that belief, but we think it does later. But it is that where the head knowledge that you can be persuaded, which is, we're going to get into the linguistics of it, you can be persuaded that he is who he says he is, becomes insufficient. And that's the standard that even the demons have. They are convinced, they know that he is, but there is no, I don't even know. That's why I call this a devotional topic only, because it is purely a spiritual thing that can only be wrestled with God. I mean, he's using this term 98 different times in various contexts, and using it in some cases to say, yes, they did. They believed and it was unto faith. But they believed and it wasn't. And so just looking at it and saying, what is it that's the difference here? What is belief and what is required of me? And when, I think that's just a basic concept of what salvation is, that asking Jesus into your heart is an expression of the desire, but I'm not sure it's the escrow closing on the transaction. I think that is the assent, and for some people, that's all it takes. Some people are spiritually sensitive, and that transaction happens like a connection. And then other people, it's okay, well, now I've been persuaded, but it might take time to get to that place. And so and that's how it happened in my heart, and that's the reason I know it's true. I know there are people out there that it can happen in an instant, but I don't believe that I was saved when I first acknowledged that he is the God of the universe. I don't think it was a mental, that logically makes sense. And all the things that I've been taught, man, they've all started to line up. And this is, I can't persuade myself otherwise, because the other arguments are insane. And it was very much a head thing. And then it was years later that it became okay, you are God. I want you to be my God. And it became personal. And that's when that's a bad use of the term. That's when I think I believed. I did not believe at the point where I assented to a truth. Like, this is the God of the universe. He doesn't argue for his own existence anywhere in the Bible.
Are you equating salvation and belief then?
No, belief is the door that opens it up to faith. Salvation comes through faith, which is of him. But that belief is the only, I have to assent to be saved. I don't do anything to my salvation, but I have to, not assent, that's not the right word. I have to accept. I have to truly embrace in some way, or submit is probably the best word I can think of.
So you think belief is binary or is it gradient?
What's that?
Is belief binary? You either do or you don't, or is it gradient? So I'm thinking Mark 8:34, I believe, my unbelief.
Yep.
Or we can give little faith, that suggests that
that suggests that it continues beyond salvation.
Binary, you do or you don't believe.
That the belief that opens the door to salvation, I believe there's that he knows your heart, and that at some point salvation is once and done, that Christ enters in and gives you the faith unto salvation. That happens, but then the belief that we continue to develop throughout that we pray for greater faith and greater belief just to access his heart, to know him better, that doesn't stop at salvation. That continues. And he, throughout John, it seems to be this building, there's no crescendo at salvation. It just continues to grow. And so as Christians, we should be looking at every one of these examples of, and they believed, Well, what was different about that set of belief? And Lord, help me open my heart to believe like they did. Oh, Lord, protect me that I don't believe for the reasons that he said is insufficient, and just kind of understanding what I want to, the key warning of this is the Gospels are not repetitive. It's not in here 98 times so that it's like a metronome or it's not like a ball peen hammer where he's trying to pound it into your head by just saying the same thing over and over and over and over. Each one of them has a purpose. It is sculpted and it is a strategic message that works together. And warning number 2 is the Gospels are not repetitive. Between Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, there's not repetition. The same story is told in different instances to establish different truths. It's not a matter of Matthew tells the feeding of the 5,000 and John tells it. They focus on, and there's truth in the distinctions. What does Matthew tell you that John doesn't? John leaves things out because they're not what the Spirit felt was essential for his goal of salvation, of belief. Matthew's goal is to establish Christ as the Messiah of Israel, the fulfillment of prophecy. And so he'll focus on truths, even within the same narrative, that go to establish who he is from a messianic standpoint, that John will just skip right over. And one of the best examples we're going to find is John's treatment of Jesus walking on water is borderline hilarious. Like, it's a sentence. Oh, and he walked on water and then the boat was on the shore. Literally. The boat was halfway across the sea, then Jesus walked on water, and the next thing we knew it was on the shore. Whereas in each one of the other Gospels, it is a detailed narrative, and it talks about him being master of the wind and the waves and the water. It talks about Peter's agreement, and they're all there for a purpose. And they're all there to fit the intent of that author's mission, right? And we've talked about that each of them have a different directive, so that just because you see the same story told in Matthew and in John, do not assume you've read the story from that point of view. Matthew is going to tell you things that establish him as the Messiah of Israel, and it may have prophetic implications. There's a lot to learn in the differences of what the Holy Spirit highlights in each account. It's not just repetition. And in the same way, in John, saying belief and belief in salvation 98 times is not just the Holy Spirit's limited vocabulary. It is, okay, we have belief. What's going on around it? Okay, is my life circumstance similar to this? Do we encounter things that are... Why is this encounter different from that encounter when he did commit himself, but in this case he didn't? There's parallels, but just being sensitive to the fact that, yes, you put something in there 98 times, very clearly you're trying to emphasize a concept, but that's not all. A lot of commentaries, a lot of the discussions you hear around this topic is that something is in there repetitively because it's to emphasize the point. I know that's not true for a lot of reasons. It's one reason, but the word love is only mentioned 17 times in the Gospels. That's an important point. If we're just doing it on repetition alone, if the Holy Spirit works purely on the basis of emphasis, I feel like that one should have gotten a little more playtime. It's very strategic. This is a crafted message that is meant for your learning. He uses belief 98 times in the book because one of those times might be you. You might identify with one of the 98 and someone else might be sensitive to the differences. Be sensitive to the times when he says, well, but that wasn't belief that opened the door to faith. Level 2 is it's worth the time to get into the language of it. As with a lot of things that we've talked about, the Greek is very, very specific. And a lot of times, just like with saved, that we went into epic detail on, we translate something belief 3 different times, and it's 3 different Greek words. And so you get a kind of a different message if you understand, and we'll break that down in the next one. I'll try not to take too much time because it's boring for anyone that's not into it, but it's valuable to make sure you understand that they're not all the same word or the same meaning behind it. And then level 3 is the illustration of it. What's going on around it? Why in this instance did that belief, it says, well, they believed in him. Why did he reject it? Okay, well, he says in this instance, he knew that their hearts weren't truly in it. Or in the other instance, they believed, but they didn't act. There was no corresponding fruit. There was no obedience. There's going to be different examples where we highlight what's going on around and why is that belief different. So don't think that each example where he says, everyone who believes in me shall have eternal life, even within those, they can sound identical. There's a different message. It's not the Holy Spirit just running out, like trying to fill pages. Be sensitive to each time he's addressing an issue. And we need to step back and take the time to look at it and say, why is it important that you put it in here this time, in this scenario, in this way? And why did you phrase it that way? Even as simple as like, why and sometimes does he say believed in his name? Or why in other times does it say believed in the one who sent me? And not in him, right? There are distinctions. I don't have the answer to all of them, but I know that it's precise. I know that the Holy Spirit wasn't just willy-nilly saying, these people believed in his name. These people believed in his word, and therefore, these people believed in the one who sent him, right? There's differences. I think there is meaning in that. The easiest one to just knock out before, and we'll try to, as we go forward, be a little more. John is very consistent, but as you go through the rest of the Bible, I hope this is something that you take the time to do. One way that belief is translated is the paitheo, and that's the paitheo is the Greek of all these is it's pistis or pistis is the word for faith. So the root word in Greek for all of these is the top level, which is interesting because it's almost always the opposite. The root is usually the base feeling and then adding to the greater. This goes the other way around. But the paitheo or pythos is to be persuaded. So I believe because someone has shown me the truth of something. So someone believed because Deb gave me irrefutable facts that 2 + 2 = 4. I agree. I cannot dispute that. I have been persuaded. And then another, and that's a passive. Someone else persuades you. To have been persuaded is a thing that happens to you. It's a passive tense. Then the next, which is where we live in the book of John, is to believe, is the pisteo, or it's the acceptance. It's the beyond persuasion. It's the having confidence in or accepting something as truth. But more importantly, it's the active form. It is the assent. It's the I am now in agreement. We are. It's not just that you've convinced me of the truth. I have now adopted it as truth, right? So you've gone from the passive to the active, and John almost always uses this tense. And then what we ran into Romans, the entire book of Romans uses belief over and over. We again go back to the passive, and it's the pistis, which is faith. And that is the faith that God instills in you. Once you have opened the door through your agreement, Lord, I want you to be my Lord, then it says he will instill in you the belief, the like capital B belief, which is translated faith in some instances and belief in others, which is why we get some confusion there. But that is the ultimate when it's belief unto salvation is the belief that translates into faith, and only he can give you that faith, which is the craziest part of all of this, is what we went through in Romans. Your obligation is to submit yourself to something that you've already been persuaded of, and then he will do the rest. He will build faith in you. That faith is a gift of God, lest anyone should boast. You can't even brag that you generated your own faith. He did that in you. All you did was open the door and allow him submit. And so as you go through these, being conscious where it says they believed, make sure it's not saying, well, they were just persuaded, because then that makes sense, right? That's not what we're talking about here. And that's going to be fodder for every other book of the Bible. That's not going to be great application in John. But to be persuaded is something that's done to you, and that's generally the theme of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, is they're establishing a truth. They are making, they have each of them their different narrative. That Matthew, for example, is establishing that Jesus is the Messiah of Israel, and in each case he is attempting to teach something that you can then be persuaded, that you might be persuaded. John is taking you to that next level, that having been persuaded, that you might believe. And you'll find about 25 different commentaries from like Quaker to present that are titled That You May Believe. If you look up that book title, you'll find about at least 25 or 30 commentaries on the book of John. It is the central theme, and he always uses this form of belief with two exceptions. And then you get into the what goes on to salvation, what is the gift of God, and that's the term we just hammered on throughout the book of Romans, is God's gift of that faith, that taking your belief and God takes your belief and then he holds it in his hands and he grows it as long as you allow him. And then he gives you credit for it as if you've done something, which is the miracle of salvation. So there's a language component to it that's very important. And I do not believe that the order in which these are portrayed is coincidence. It is a building. It's Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are meant to persuade of a truth. They are factual. They are narrative accounts. And then John is, having had that persuasion, taking it to the next. And then you get into the epistles where it's salvation and it's more doctrine. So you can establish the language side of it, but then the counter to that is it's not always language. You do also have to, it is a meditation and a prayer issue, and it's a heart thing, because you can't get through the book of John and understand it without the Spirit's guidance. Going through and just translating in John, now he was in Jerusalem at the Passover during the feast, and many believed in his name. It is the same. Epistuson, it believed in his name when they saw the signs which he did. But Jesus did not epistuson them. They believed in him. He didn't believe in them. It's even more powerful when you translate it to the Greek. He says, I didn't commit myself. The King James says, he didn't commit himself to them. It says, they believed in him. He didn't believe in them because he knew their hearts, right? And so you've got two different types of belief, and all you can go on is the surrounding, is the context. God knows your heart, and he will know good belief unto salvation from head level, from whatever's being taught here as the insufficient. And then just going through these, you can see the use of this same term is consistent throughout, and it makes it difficult in the book of John, because in the positive, he's using the same term. They believed. So whatever it is, they accepted, but their heart wasn't behind it. So maybe they took it to that next level of accepting it as truth, but it wasn't accepting it as truth for the right reasons. And so that's why I say you cannot discern the book of John without the Holy Spirit. It's not so simple as translating it to language and, this is just that simple kind. This is the persuaded kind, and the rest of these are real belief. It's the reason you have to struggle and pray through this book. So that's kind of my background. Go ahead.
If I heard you correctly, just a couple minutes ago, you said he did not believe in them because he knew their hearts. And the fact that you used the word belief, I'm a little bit uncertain of what you meant. In the King James it says,
He did not commend himself to them.
but Jesus did not commit himself unto them, and I don't.
Look up the Greek. It's the same exact word. I have no idea why they translated it in one way and one, but it's the same word. If you have your interlinear Bible, even the King James is not error-proof, but they're trying to get the message across, but it literally uses the same word in both instances. And so that's why you always should, I don't say always should, but there is a prayer side of this that maybe you're not a language expert, maybe you haven't gotten into the Greek, but there is a discernment to it that what is it that's behind this, and it comes across, I think, the same, that they believed in him, but he wasn't whatever to them because he knew their hearts. I think it's interesting that it says, it's sort of almost poetic, that they believed in him, but he didn't believe in them. But yeah, I'm happy to bring. Have you taken a look at the interlinear Bible I had? I brought it in here a couple times. It's useful because it's got even if you don't speak, even if you're not like reading in Greek, it's got the King James, and then above it, it's got Hebrew for the Old Testament, and in New Testament, it's got Greek above it. So even if you're just recognizing, like, wait a second, it says this word looks exactly the same as that word. Why is it translated different in two different places? You know, and
Yeah,
it,
in the Strong's.
yes,
The Greek and the Hebrew.
well, and that's why they did the 9100 and stuff like. That's why they instituted all those the numbers for some of these key terms, and that's what should be like a clue that. Well, it's got a 9100 here and a 9100 here, and it says believes in, and then it says did not commend himself to. I need to go, why? What the heck is the deal with that? And sometimes you'll find explanations that this was a note, but for the most part, it's, and some of the different translations in the future will correct it, but that's a more in the way of a warning when I say take the time to look into the language behind it, because there may be something hidden that you can easily answer your own question just by, is that the actual word that's being used? But for the most part, it's spiritually discerned.
Is there anywhere in the Bible where it says he believes in us? That doesn't ring the bell for me.
No, I don't think so. Not that I'm aware of. But yeah, except here. It says he did not believe in them. But I don't think there's a he is God and having.
You know, like when the people who wanted him to be a king and delivered them from the Romans, he didn't commit himself to them to go along with their vision and fulfill it for them.
That's what I assume, because it's the same concept. Yeah, and it's just interesting that a lot of times with the translation stuff, if you go back and look at the history of it, there's notes behind it, even back to the King James. A lot of the time, they thought that's what it was getting at, and so they use that terminology, and they make assumptions. We're going to go through a weird example here, that Proverbs 30, that I can just point out some of the absolute inconsistencies in the King James even. So there is value in taking the time and going verse by verse and saying, is there a translation issue here? But that to me is secondary. The more important thing is just praying through this, and what's the difference in this one? Why is this here and not just and the answer I don't think is repetition. But okay, so I keep going here as we get into chapter 6. Went through last week, and I kept this here just to highlight the point that Jesus is not just like a nomad, and the portrayal of Christ, because he says the Son of Man has no home or has no place to lay his head. A lot of people picture Jesus as being just constantly a rover, like on a gypsy path where he goes throughout Israel. We really only see him in two places throughout the Gospels. He goes from Galilee, around Capernaum, down to Bethlehem, to the Jordan, up, down, up, and he was just a Jew. Like, he was not doing anything that most Jews didn't do. You're required to come to Bethlehem for the spring feast. Every able-bodied Jew needs to come to Bethlehem for the spring feast and the fall feast, and then there's another feast in the middle. Each time we see him traveling between, it'll call out, and at the time of Passover, he was in Jerusalem for this. And at the feast of the Jews, he headed to Jerusalem. And it was nearing the time of Passover, and he feared to go to Jerusalem. So this like nomadic lifestyle that we portray Christ of is emblematic of what it meant to be a Jew in that time. Everyone in the spring and in the fall that was able to travel had to go to the temple for Passover and the 3 fall feasts. And so that's what we see him doing. We just see him on this road between where he made his home in Capernaum and around the Sea of Galilee. Twice a year we see him heading down to Jerusalem, and we see different events happening in Jerusalem around the temple. And then we see, and he returned to Galilee. And then it says, and as he was heading back to Jerusalem, and then he returned to Capernaum. That's this path that he's on, and right now we've just finished in chapter 5. He had made his trip to Bethlehem for the fall feast, and now he's on his way back. And it says, and these things, Jesus went over the Sea of Galilee, which is in the Sea of Tiberias. The last thing John says, and he was in Jerusalem for the feast of the Jews. And now he starts off this chapter, and after these things, Jesus went to the Sea of Galilee. Matthew and Mark will both tell you he traveled up following the feast. He did this and fill in some events that happened. But that's just not John's way. He was here, now he is here. And then he is there, and now he was there. And it's just emblematic of the style. It launches immediately, and without any preamble, without any, without much explanation. We have about 6 months that went by between chapter 5 and chapter 6, and then he just launches, and we'll see he was just in for the Feast of the Jews, which is generally how they refer to the fall feast. They'll say Passover for the spring feasts, but it says here in chapter 6, after these things Jesus went over the Sea of Galilee, which is in the Sea of Tiberias, or which is the Sea of Tiberias, so two names for the same body of water. And a great multitude followed him, because they saw the signs which he performed and on those who were diseased. And Jesus went up on the mountain, and there he remained, it says there he sat, but there he remained with his disciples. Now Passover, Feast of the Jews, was near. So last time we saw him, it was saying he was heading to Jerusalem for the Feast of the Jews. The next story says Passover was near. So we're 6 months, he's back up in the north. 6 months has passed because Passover is near. He's about to have to embark back to Jerusalem. And that's kind of John's way of very, not artfully, but just giving you a timeline. He always marks things out by the Feast of the Jews. You can just say, you can develop a timeline of the life of Christ just based on each of the Gospels marking out his different trips every 6 months to head down to Jerusalem. And that's generally how the time is established. Then Jesus lifted. So the other part that we keep focusing on is we have this idea of 13, people wandering around Israel, and this was a movement that people were talking about. But all the way from the beginning here, the narrative and the language is that this is building a mass following. The first story that's told after the wedding at Cana is many believed in him, that many sought to follow him, that by the time he left Jerusalem after cleansing the temple, he gets back up to the north, which is a walking trip. And, after having stopped in Samaria, and by the time he gets there, it says everyone had heard of the signs and wonders that were performed in Jerusalem. This has become a national thing at this point. 5,000 people gathering, which is probably closer to like 15,000 because it says 5,000 men plus women and children. We're thinking 15,000 people is probably, there's about, Josephus estimates about 900,000 people in Israel, not counting the Romans, during that period. So just based on how many lambs were killed at each Passover, they weren't allowed to do a census. So he does all his numbering of the people based on how many lambs, because it was only one per however many people. And so just estimating out for families, estimates 900,000 people. Galilee is the very far north of the country. It's the northern border of Israel, and it's among the smaller. And so let's just call it of the 9 tribal regions that remain, because a few of them are like Ephraim and Manasseh are together. So there's 12 total, but some of them are kind of lumped together. Let's just say it's 100,000 people. That's probably a fairly safe estimate if there's 900,000 in the whole country, and this is the least populous part in the far north. And you've got 15,000 gathering of the 100,000 there. That's a big chunk of the population. People are aware of what he's doing. People are paying attention. It's a mass movement at this point. And this is the chapter where he's going to half that. He's going to say, now there's no more casual following. It's going to get kind of radical from here based on the things I'm going to tell you. But the reason I bring that up every single time we tell one of these stories is it's an authentication marker. That many people, if these things weren't happening, that many people hadn't seen signs and miracles, and it claims there were 15,000 people at this gathering who were fed from baskets to loaves and fishes, someone comes forward and says, wait a second, no, I was in Galilee at that time. That never happened. These are not private works. These are very public, and you will not find a record among the Romans or the Jews that the things claimed, the miracles, the signs and wonders, I was there. That didn't happen. There's not a record to be found. And if there were ever 2 sets of people that kept meticulous records, it's the Jews and it's the Romans. The Jews kept religious and social records, and the Romans kept political records. So if these things weren't happening and someone claimed they were, you would find evidence. And so there's no making doctrine from silence, but I think there is an authentication factor there. And I think that a lot of the gospel writers go out of their way to say, and many people were there, and many believed in them, and the multitudes came, and everyone that was in the region came out to see John the Baptist, and all of Jerusalem. Makes a wild statement. All of Jerusalem was at the Jordan. It probably wasn't literally all of Jerusalem, but it says all of Judea had come out to see him. And yeah.
But are you saying that it authenticates that
That-
it's happened, or who he is? Or
No, just the reality of these events. That like when it says that he took 5 loaves of bread and fed 5,000 people, someone comes forward and says, "No, that didn't happen. I was in the region at the time. They were at that, Yep.
The reason I'm asking is because there are people who say that the Holocaust never happened, but it's still a fact.
Sure. Yeah.
And I'm thinking about the Antichrist, when he is revealed, huge numbers of people will respond and follow.
Everyone.
What would that authenticate?
It's not. It's an authentication for you. It's when you're thinking of like, can't do I believe that these things are true? It's not proselytizing. The word is what saves people. You're not going to save people by going out and saying, hey, just statistically speaking, someone would have came forward and said this. For me, it's just I believe there are like tokens the Holy Spirit puts in the text to bolster your faith. That like I think these things happen. This isn't fairy tales. This isn't fables. This isn't a small group of 12 guys who told these stories and got together and all agreed to tell the same story. Because if that was the case, someone comes forward and says, none of those things happened. Like, I believe from a historical standpoint that not just I have faith that this is truth, but I believe from a historical standpoint that you can prove that these things happened. And there's authentication that comes through that. It may have no value to some. To me, just the pure logic of it, that I believe if these were cleverly devised fairy tales, there would be a whole slew of attack on, I was there at that time, they claimed this happened, that never happened, we never saw dead people walking the streets, that type of thing. So it's, again, not to build gospel, but it's just, I believe it's in all these stories for a reason. And I believe we have a misconception of what the life of Christ probably looked like. I don't think he had peace with his 12 disciples and was alone. I think by this point in his ministry, he was dogged by people everywhere he went, and he was very much the center of the political and religious landscape in the time at that point. So again, keeping going through here. Now the Passover feast of the Jews was near. So time marker, we're another 6 months down the road. And the narrative of this is much more succinct, as John's style. Then Jesus lifted up his eyes, and seeing a great multitude coming toward him, he said to Philip, "Where shall we buy bread, that these may eat meat?" But this he said to test him, for he himself knew what he would do. Philip answered him and said, 200 denarii worth of bread is not sufficient for them, and every one of them may have a little. There's probably significance in the fact that he uses 200 denarii. I haven't even tried to track that down, but a denarii is a day's wage. For a Roman soldier, a denarii is 1 day's wages, and so it's saying it's not like a penny, but it's a substantial amount of money. And so when we talk about there being famine in the land, it would say a denarii for a loaf of bread. So a whole day's worth of work for 200 people wouldn't feed this many. He's making the case that we can't come close to covering this figure. One of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, and this is one thing that I pointed out the first time we were introduced to Andrew, he's one of my favorite people. You will not see him except for introducing people to Christ. The only time you will see his name mentioned is bringing someone to Christ. First it's Peter. He's going to do it 4 more times. You will only see Andrew mentioned bringing someone to Christ. Like, I think that's very intentional. I don't know what significance it has, but it makes me love Andrew. And Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, said to him, "There is a lad here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 small fish, but what are these among so many?" And It's kind of an honest question. I'm like, sorry, this is it's the best we could do, but I got something. I brought someone to him. And Jesus said, make the people sit down. And now there was much grass in the place. So the men sat down in number about 5,000. And Jesus took the loaves, and when he had given thanks, he distributed them. And I have it crossed out here to the disciples, because most of your Bibles will have a footnote that's not in any of their original transcripts. It says that Jesus distributed them, and then it says the disciples handed them out. So presumably they handed them out, but there's a significance to this that I think that's interesting. I skipped my note. It says, Jesus took the loaves, and when he had given thanks, he distributed them. For our later conversation, I would like you to note he did not break the bread. It says he just distributed it. Of course, these are made in loaves. We assume he broke the bread. The only time you will see Christ breaking the bread is the Last Supper. He will hand out bread 4 different times. He will never break the bread. And that's going to be very important for our analogy here that he's building to. Obviously, I think there are things behind the scenes, but I think the Holy Spirit very intentionally doesn't say that Christ broke the bread and distributed it. He's building a type here.
Don't you think, just to think about it, did they get to watch it multiply? Did it just poof, and then it was there? Or
where'd the baskets come from? It says all of a sudden they had 12 they had baskets to hand them out. I picture it's all of a sudden it's boo, there's a basket sitting there. No one brought food. Why did they bring baskets? So either someone just had a whole pile of baskets and brought up. I think legitimately baskets are appearing, because
I think it's crazy that no one brought food but a little kid.
Yeah,
And
weird.
He was just oh sure, have my lunch.
Yeah,
I'm thinking about the kid.
right.
There's a lot of things.
That's why there's just so much interplay that it's very clearly designed. It was a setup. They don't leave town. This is a 25-mile walk. They left town with no food. You're walking, this is pretty close to the arid desert region. Yes, there's water here, but you're walking out of Capernaum and a good distance to get to anything. And so anyway, there's no town nearby. They had no food. They didn't bring food, but somehow they had enough baskets to pass this thing around. This is a weird miracle, but I think it's I do the same thing. I sit here and imagine are they just standing there and a basket's in their hand, and you're or each time they tear one off, it's regenerating. None of the Gospels give you the specifics of it, which also is intriguing to me. Why don't they tell you how it happened? On any of the miracles, why don't they tell you what they observed? It's just it's a faith statement.
In the other Gospels, does it say that he distributed it to his disciples?
It says that it doesn't say, it says the next statement that the disciples distributed it to the people. It doesn't say, it says he gave thanks and then the disciples distributed it.
And Matthew says that he broke it and gave it to the disciples.
That Jesus broke it? I think I looked this one up. I'll find that one again, because I think it says he divided it among, and then it says he broke it. Because I was looking up the language behind it to see if it was partitioned or broke the bread.
Yeah.
But yeah, we'll go back to that.
Because I was thinking of Jesus when he cooked the fish for the disciples, and he said to Peter, "Do you love me? Feed my sheep. Feed my lambs."
Yep. And so they were the ones in the capacity. Well, and I think that's...
It's a different word for love, too.
You're right. Each time he goes through that. But I think that's why when it talks about he's got... there's 12 baskets left over. I think the significance of that is there's 12 disciples. They each had a basket and were handing it out, right? I think that's kind of the idea of when there's 12 baskets remaining, each of their baskets was still full. It's not I don't necessarily see a...
But isn't it what they picked up after? Not what they initially handed out, the basket being full.
Right. I'm saying each of them still had their basket, the basket so they were the ones feeding people, and they filled their basket with what was left over after everyone had filled themselves. Okay. So that after having seen that, after having watched whatever happened, whether baskets are appearing out of nowhere or whatever the miraculous methodology is by which this happened, I think the reaction of the crowd, the reaction of the people that came, is an important point where it says, after the 5 barley loaves which were left over by those who had eaten, then those men who they had seen the sign that Jesus did, so they had just seen a miracle that Jesus did, said, "This is truly a prophet who has come into the world." Like, this is analogous to some of the earlier, where this is analogous to Nicodemus's response is, "We know that you are a teacher." They've heard him speak. They've heard of the signs and wonders, and their reaction to seeing one is, "Surely this is a prophet," right? They're not saying, like the disciples say, like the woman at the well says, like the Samaritan said, "Truly this is the Son of God," right? That was the reaction of the heathens when they saw it, of the Samaritans. This is the Savior of the world. But the Jews said, "True, well, I've seen a miracle, this must be a prophet," right? And so that is part of what leads Christ to his next statement when he returns after having seen them is, you only came back because I fed you. This isn't faith. You're not coming back because there's belief, right? You're coming back because you were fed. And that launches him into the bread of life. But their reaction is very important here. It's short of the right reaction. Having seen a work of God, their reaction is, surely you're some sort of prophet. You're equal to Isaiah. You're equal to Malachi. Not who he's claiming to be. He wasn't standing there silent. They didn't follow him, and he was just doing miracles and not talking. He taught everywhere he went, and I can guarantee you he claimed to be who he is, and yet they took it to the point of, this is a prophet.
I was listening to the recording of the last lesson, and the nobleman and the military
Yep.
father. What hit me that I'd never seen before was that they recognized someone with authority.
Yeah, that's why that's exactly right. These stories have this common thread of, what was your reaction to Christ? Like, they didn't know anything about, the governor was not a Jew, the centurion was not a Jew. They just recognized, this is someone with whatever authority, with the power to, and yet the Jews are saying, well, this must be a prophet, right? And your reaction to Christ is what matters. Like, your belief is defined by what happens inside. I say, I assent that he's a prophet, or I assent that he is the Son of the living God, which is what he then says, right on. That is faith. That's what John's building up to, is don't stop at, I believe he is, even what Matthew's trying to describe, the Messiah. Great. You need to believe he is the Messiah. Don't stop there. He is also the Son of the living God, which is a concept that the Jews were not expecting in the Messiah. They might have adopted a military leader as being the Messiah ben David, and the whole expectation behind that. They may have agreed that someone is the Messiah. They didn't go so far as to say the Messiah is God. That's where they stopped short. They will acknowledge, when he comes again, the prerequisite to his second coming is their recognition that he is of God. And all of the confrontation with the Jewish leaders was around his claims to being the Son of God. If he had they even asked, are you that prophet? Are you the one who comes? I think if he would have just said, yeah, I'm the guy that was prophesied for, and then he coupled that with miracles, they would have accepted him as the Messiah. They never would have accepted him as the Son of God, and that's why they sought to kill him, as he claimed to be his claim to deity.
Well, like with the nobleman and the military man, they both had authority in different domains. What I wondered was, where do they think his authority comes from? They recognize his authority, but what is the basis of his authority? That's not addressed in the scripture, but
I think
maybe the heavens, or I don't know.
it's a perfect distinction. What's the thing in nature that testifies of God? Right? You don't have to. What is it that Moses believed in that God accounted to him for righteousness? It's not a measure of knowledge. The centurion recognized that this man has authority. Someone who has never heard the gospel can look at nature and say, surely there is a God. and that can be accounted to them for righteousness because God knows their heart. It's not knowledge. And he then goes on to say, you have the knowledge. You, the Jews, have the knowledge. When he's talking to the Samaritans, he said, we have the knowledge. They know all the right. And yet they're not following. And you, Samaritans, which even Jesus kind of denigrates there, you have faith. And that's even with the centurion. He says, surely I've not seen greater faith in Israel than among this man. But he doesn't even know what he believes. He just knows this man has authority. This man is of God or of whatever it is that has power. And that's enough. Like that's, if you don't have, he doesn't require knowledge. He requires submission. He requires belief. And that's why you can say that even if all you had was nature, you'll be held accountable. You can recognize from nature that there is a living God and that he has authority over you. You are a created being. And so that, yeah, they're absolutely targeted statements. And then going back to our structure of 777, if you aren't fully convinced that John is doing this in a structural way and that he's got a method behind it, his treatment of Jesus walking on water should be the nail in the coffin, because we got to make sure that's not counted as one of the miracles, right? That's not one of my 7. Each one of the 7 miracles that John highlights, he highlights for a very specific purpose to show aspects of the deity of Christ. And then when it's another one that's not one of his 7 miracles, his treatment is, now when evening came, his disciples went down to the sea and got into the boat and went over towards Capernaum, and it was already dark, and Jesus had not come to them. Then the seas arose because a great wind was blowing. So when they had rowed about 3 or 4 miles, about a little over halfway across the sea, they saw Jesus walking on the sea and drawing near by the boat, and they were afraid. But he said to them, it is I, do not be afraid. Then they willingly received him in the boat, and immediately the boat was at the land where they were going. I mean, there's nothing here. Like this is a transportation note, right? How do you get from the other side? Oh yeah, he walked on the water, he got in the boat, and then and the next thing we knew, we were on the other side. When he starts talking about the miracles, he tells you what people's reaction were, the conversation. If it's one of the 7, he gives you the details behind it. If it's not, he says, I mean, this one's too cool to pass up. So I got to mention that the guy walked on water, but it was just, here and there. So I think that treatment of it is one of the things that really shows that there is a structure here, and it's very consistent. If you then overlay this with the book of Revelation, does the exact same thing. If it's inconvenient for his 777 structure, he gives things like a two-word cursory mention. And I saw an angel in fiery glory. And that's it. And you're like, well, don't you think we should delve into that a little bit? He doesn't talk about Peter walking on the water and going to meet him. He just says he walked up, got in the boat, and then we were on the other side.
Well, the disciples were supposed to be witnesses, and that's saying, I saw it too.
Yeah, exactly. You got to mention it, but it's not part of the case that he is building. He is a prosecutor, or he's a defense attorney building a case that that the Messiah was the Son of the living God. And he mentions things that are part of his life, but the things that he highlights all follow that 777, and each one of those attributes goes to a part of his character. You see a lot of these storms. I think this is worth mentioning as a side note. You see a lot of these storms on the Sea of Galilee. We get actually 3 of them mentioned. I firmly believe these are not natural storms. These are either God made for the purpose of illustrating or performing a miracle, or they're demonic in one case because Jesus stands up and rebukes the wind. He doesn't just say, be calm. He rebukes the wind and the waves. The other part is these are professional fishermen who have spent their entire life fishing on this sea, and in each case, they're terrified. But even more so, if you've been to Seattle, the Sea of Galilee is about the size of Lake Union. You can see right across it. You're not terrified if you're out on Lake Union in a huge storm. You can swim that if you need to. These are storms that are supernatural in some case, enough to scare professional lifelong fishermen on what is essentially a 6-mile by 6-mile lake. Right? The Sea of Galilee is not big. That entire region is about the size of the Idaho Panhandle. It's not huge. So when we keep seeing these events, I very much believe there is a supernatural aspect to it, whether it's, demonic in an attempt to challenge their faith and then Christ rebukes the wind and the waves, and then immediately they're stilled, and for that reason they know he is the master of the wind and waves, or whether God allowed this massive, horrifying storm on a lake so that he could walk out there and calm their fears and have the narrative. But I think it's just, we have this image of the Sea of Galilee being like, shore is hundreds of miles away, and they were in peril and they were terrified. There's something more going on here. These are, like I said, professionals.
You say it's demonic, you're saying that they would have control over the weather.
Which, I don't know. I have to believe there's influence. I have to believe that they have influence beyond anything I can comprehend. What I don't understand is if God made the wind and the waves to do that, if this was natural, why would he rebuke a natural force? Rebuke is a pretty strong concept. This is I don't know. And I could be entirely wrong. I just know this isn't a natural phenomenon.
Did you look up the word rebuke in this case?
No, I haven't. Yeah, I can.
Neither.
Yeah, interesting. I bet it's just not like there's something being highlighted here. The fact that these guys spent their lives fishing on a lake that's the size of Lake Union, and they were caught off guard, caught in a storm on the lake that size. It takes like 15 minutes to sail across the thing. And if there was a big storm head up top, they don't leave. These are fishermen, and they were terrified of whatever. In each case, it goes out of the way to mention that all the disciples were horrified on this lake.
But it says they were terrified after they saw Jesus walk.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, it could be that they thought this is different from the other one. Certainly the other one where the waves were crashing into, they were terrified for their life. Seeing someone walking out would probably get my attention too.
If you didn't recognize him right away,
You would think it was a specter of some kind. Yeah. I only highlight that just because I think it's an interesting perspective that it's much, much smaller than what I had in mind. I pictured like them out on the roiling seas and in each of these cases. But when it says they were 4 miles out, they had rowed for 4 miles, then Jesus walked up to them, and the next thing they know, they're at the shore, where they were only 1.5 miles away to begin with. It's not like we didn't transport them hundreds of miles across the open ocean. Some of these are, it's an interesting.
They were translated?
Yeah, I mean, immediately the boat was there, but it's not. They would have been able to see where they were going from there, even in like darkness. I would presume, but anyway, neither here nor there. It's totally just a side point that I think is interesting. Okay, so that ends up being a footnote in the middle of this narrative that the crowds had followed him, and then he goes into the mountains. And if we go back to that slide,
I'm sorry, quick question. 21.
Yep.
On your side it says, and they willingly received him into the boat. In my version, and they wanted to take him into the boat, which is different than him getting in the boat.
what version are you using?
New Revised Standard Version.
Oh, I've never heard that one. Yeah, I'm using New King James. Interesting why they would choose. They wanted to take him in, but then the boat was all of a sudden at the shore. So it sure seems like he at least was still with them. And then it says that when he arrived, they asked him, "How'd you get here?" So it seems like he got in the boat. Weird that they would translate it. They wanted him to. That is interesting. Okay, so the last part of this, which is actually a majority of the chapter, is Christ's statement about being, "I am the bread of life," right? And we're going to go through his narrative pretty quickly here because it's more of a conversation where he's challenging the masses and he's just using these terms. But I want you to first shift your mindset before you start faulting the crowds, that even if you'd seen someone perform a miracle and you didn't understand these concepts, there's someone standing up ahead of you and saying, "Unless you eat my flesh and drink my blood, you will not have everlasting life." And you grew up in a Jewish culture where it is the law of Moses. There is nothing about eating the flesh of humans. What are you talking about? This is insane.
Blood is always forbidden.
blood is forbidden even in animals. It's a kosher diet. You have to drain the blood. Blood is absolutely forbidden, and so is cannibalism in almost every culture. And you have a man standing in front of you saying, these are the words, unless you eat my flesh and drink my blood, you will by no means enter the kingdom of heaven. After you've got a recipe for entering the kingdom of heaven that's laid out in tremendous detail under the law by a sacrificial system and faith in the coming promises of God, and then someone stands up and says, I know you've heard all that, but unless you eat my flesh and drink my blood, you're not going to heaven. Tell me you've got the faith to say, oh, yeah, totally, I know what he means. If you do, you're better than the disciples, because they didn't. Even the 12 didn't understand. They had just experienced that deeper level that whatever he said is truth. Like it had sunk in. It had that they were, and he goes on to say, these things are spiritually discerned. These things are only going to be understood through spiritual.
I've never looked at it this way before until just now. I think about Jesus saying, can you drink the cup that I will drink? Does it mean unless we are willing to die for our friend Jesus,
Yeah, that's
we will not enter?
well, and we went into that in Romans, that like unless you are crucified with him, there you are not one. To be baptized is not the manifestation of dipping yourself in water. Baptism is being baptized into his death, is that I have died and he now lives in me, and unless I'm willing to give all, I have no part in him. And that's, again, these are radical statements. This is not like casual discipleship. This is unless you are entering into my death, unless you are willing to consider yourself dead to faith. The old man is dead and the new man that Christ lives through you. You have no part in me. And now you've got a preacher standing on the shores of Galilee saying, I know all you've heard and I know all you've read in your faith, but unless you eat my blood, unless you eat my flesh and drink my blood, you have no part in me. You have no, and you can understand the like, how can this be? Our reaction is very favorable to Christ because you have this personal relationship with him, but you should be able to take a step back and very much sympathize with the angst that this would create in a Jewish society where they had the law, they had the means by which they could please God, and then someone stands up and says, no, none of that, unless you eat my body and drink my blood. Like, there is a serious turmoil going on. And so,
Well, except he does say over and over again, I mean, it elevates it. I mean, it definitely escalates, but he starts with, I am the bread of life. And I mean, it is Passover, it's just happening. It's not that they aren't aware of the symbolism of
you're
bread.
killing me. I have a great slide. I have a great slide that builds up to that so beautifully. No, that's exactly right. What he's counting on is them understanding the heart behind all these practices that they had. And that he's identifying it. And that's what it means for these, when he says to the disciples, come on, these things are spiritually discerned. Like, don't stop worrying about the physical part of it. I don't mean that you need to eat my body. I'm saying, like, I identify with these things. Like, it's spiritually discerned is what he's getting at. And if you're contemplating these things in a spiritual standpoint, with the things you already know, with the things that are in the law, where do you have bread in the law? Where have you seen bread be provided? Where did God provide bread? These are things that every Jew knows. And if they were spiritually listening to what he's saying, they should be connecting these dots. But the part of it that's difficult is unless you're doing that, these statements are absurd. This guy looks like a madman, right? There's no matter what he performs, unless you're spiritually sensitive, this looks like a lunatic, like coming up there and saying, I know you've read the law of Moses, but you have to eat my flesh. You would all kick me out of your church if you're either the Son of God, like that's, I believe his statements are very intentionally radical and countercultural to the Jews even, so that there is never a middle ground. You cannot believe Christ was just a good teacher. He was either the Son of the living God or he's a raving madman. And someone standing in front of you and saying, unless you eat my flesh and drink my blood, you're not getting into heaven, is a madman, unless you are the Son of God and you're pointing someone to prophetic statements about you and counting on spiritual discernment, which is, you'll find this is the first time I'm saying we need homework because there's just not enough time. The last part of this is do a study on bread in the Old Testament. Go to every place that bread is mentioned, and what is the symbolism? What's happening with the bread? And he calls himself the bread of life. What is he pointing to? Just as a foreshadowing, I also believe he is drawing a reference to the tabernacle. Study the attributes of the tabernacle. They will testify of me, because in the I am statements, he lays claim to literally every aspect of the tabernacle plus 2. Like, there's not that much furniture in there. He calls himself the bread of life. That's also the showbread, the bread of the presence, is also referred to as the bread of life. So he's saying, I am that bread. And part of it came out of Joshua putting the hidden manna in the Ark of the Covenant. And so the Jews believed this was a representation of God providing. And so they called it the bread of life. He's saying, I am this aspect. He's then going to go on and say, I am that other piece of furniture. I am the light of the world. There's also a 7-branch candlestand in the tabernacle. He's then going to go on and say, I am the door. I am the barricade. I am the barrier. He is the thing that is between the Holy of Holies and the rest of the tabernacle. And only when it is torn is there access to God. When he is broken, there is now direct access to God. And that is the significance of when he dies, the veil is split. He says, one of his I am statements, I am the veil. I am the door, the gateway. He says that I am, what's that? The good shepherd. Who is the good shepherd in Israel? Who is the shepherd of the people? The high priest is in over and over and over in Leviticus is referred to as the shepherd. The one who goes in, and the only other instrument is the high priest's altar of atonement, where he makes intercessory prayer for the people. He is saying, I am that as well. And then he even goes on to say, I am the vine and you are the branches. The vine is used over 40 times as a symbol of the nation of Israel. He is Israel. He is what it means to be governed by God. He is the fulfillment of all the prophecies that are Israel. There is significance to each one of these, and weirdly, they all just like, if you study the tabernacle, Christ is in every aspect of it in these weird, specific ways. And I think it's no coincidence that he's going furniture by furniture, item by item in the tabernacle, and like laying claim to saying, they're symbolic of me. That's me. I am that thing. Hey, by the way, that's me. Go back and look at all the attributes of the showbread. It'll tell you more about me, right? Go back and look at manna. It'll tell you more about me. I can just, as a cheat code, bread becomes a symbol of life in the Bible. Whether it's, and what's the first mention of bread in the Bible? Does anyone know that one?
Genesis
Banana?
3.
There we go. Genesis. There's no bakeries in the Garden of Eden, but the first thing that God says to Adam in the curse is, now you will toil by the sweat of your brow for the rest of your life to eat bread. Do you think Adam even knew what bread is? They were fed by trees. It says all that they needed was provided in the garden. They didn't make their own food. And yet God uses bread as, I can imagine he's going, sweet, what's bread? And it's legitimately the same word, the same Hebrew word that's used. So, either Moses used a word that he wasn't supposed to use and God didn't really call it bread and the Holy Spirit isn't inspiring this, or there's a message there that because in a fallen world, you will work. You will have to, under the law, you will earn your salvation. You will have to do these works. You will have to follow these rules and live in faith, and there will be, until the Messiah comes, there is a set of works. The sweat of your brow you will live. You have to maintain life on a daily basis through sacrifices and obeisances and ordinances. It is by the sweat of your brow that you will have life. Then they get in the wilderness. The manna is then provided of God. You cannot gather it for anyone else. You can only get life by yourself. It must be obtained through work. It's freely given, but you have to go get it. All of these figures of bread are the law. It's the basis of life. There is life in the law, but it is hard. It was very specific, and it was through a very intentional act And so each one of these various references are analogous to bread. And so then when we see Christ saying, this bread is my body, it's broken for you. He's saying now, by breaking the bread, you have life, and now you can eat it and have the eternal life. It's a contrast of life under the law and life in Christ, in using the same analogy. Yeah.
The scripture says, taste and see that the Lord is good.
Mm-hmm.
And also, David said, my soul hungers and thirsts after you. So this could be spiritual, the spiritual life.
Yeah.
In all these crowds, I mean, there must be children, and God said we have to become like a child, and I'm wondering how the children received all this. That we're listening.
It's yeah. There's a faith aspect of it, but I think as we're sitting here, you can call out all these familiar idioms of hungering after salvation and all these references, especially if you're knowledgeable in Scripture, which every Jew was. These saying, "I am that bread." I am that bread. Unless my body is broken, there is no, like, he's very specifically identifying himself and saying, go back and look. Go look at the attributes of bread, right? Why is it that they use bread in the garden as the the sweat of your brow? Why is it that manna came in the form of bread? Why is it, it's just kind of, it all fits too perfectly together, and he's counting on you having that spiritual discernment that I'm giving you information about who I am.
Yeah, because
Yep.
he's telling them that line before that he's gonna give himself up for them. This bread is my flesh, which I will give for the life of the world. So
Right.
he's telling him that,
But that's also that was not their expectation, was that the Messiah would conquer. So what are you talking about? You're going to give up your body? No, that's not the Messiah. The Messiah was going to come and conquer and set the people
but
free.
they weren't called to hear because only the people that could understand were the ones that the Father was going to give.
And that's exactly the progression he makes. Is he's saying, all of you, there are thousands here. You didn't come to me. You all came to me, but you will not believe unless the Father calls you. You won't eat. You won't partake unless the Father calls you. And we're not going to have time to read through it like we should here. But the concept of it is he's delineating the masses. He's saying all of you came for your reasons. You came because you'd be fed. You came because yesterday you were fed. But you will not actually eat of me. You won't partake of the bread of life unless my Father calls you. It's not something you can do on your own. You have to be called. And if he's called you, you will by no means be cast away. If you've been called, if you've consumed, if you've taken part in that bread of life, it is both the Father calling you. It says the will of God. And then it says it's the work of God that you believe in him. And so he's saying, I will lose none of those who my Father gives me. And then immediately after it says he lost most of the people, right? So most of the people that were there went their separate way. Like this,
Said except for the son of perdition.
right. Always calls out Judas, which he knew would betray. That this idea, I want to highlight this because we talked about this in the last chapter. It's John 5 when he says, he delineates the world and said, there's a time coming in which the world will be judged based on their works. And we talked about that's created this works-based doctrine based on their works, whether good or evil, whether for good unto salvation or evil unto damnation. And people have said, well, that's Christ teaching the value of works. No, that's chapter distinctions. If you go on to read, he says, what shall we do that we may do the work of God? Jesus said, well, only, those who do the work of God it is to believe on the one that he sent. There's only one work that matters anymore. The rest of it is for your benefit, but there's one that matters unto salvation, and it is to believe in the one who was sent. And so he goes to this analogy on himself being a fulfillment of all these prophecies around the bread that was given, and it is striking. If you just go through and look at all the references to bread, it is always in contrast as a source of life, and why in that society, especially in that area, it's a fishing community, it's not even a farming community, they're in the mountains, like bread is not It's an import. Their primary food sources are like fruits, vegetables, and fish. And yet consistently, it's bread as the staple, and always bread as an analogy of life. And so just keeping that in mind, the Catholic Church has then taken that to this idea that has to do with communion. Unless you eat his flesh and drink his blood, you can't be saved. And they call it the Eucharist, and there's the transubstantiation, where they believe that in the spiritual aspect, the bread literally becomes the flesh of Christ, and the wine becomes his blood, and that's what it means to take it in. I would fundamentally challenge that, because I do not believe communion is established in the Bible. I know that's a horrible, blasphemous statement. I do 100% participate in communion in the spirit of celebrating the sacrifice of Christ when it's given. And I take very seriously in Corinthians when it says, if you take this with the wrong heart, there is a very specific and very dramatic judgment at hand. But that's one of the reasons I know that's a reference to Passover, is because the same admonition is given in the Old Testament for taking Passover without the proper ceremonial cleansing and heart. It gives that same admonition that you will face that. And also, he keeps saying, take this bread and drink this cup. And then if you take this bread and drink this cup without the heart. It is a very specific reference to part of the Passover, and all of that draws to highlighting that he is the sacrificial Passover lamb by which we are saved. And so the whole idea of taking communion is what it means to eat his body and drink his blood is a very much missing the mark. Do not take that as you shouldn't participate. Any opportunity that you can celebrate the sacrifice that Christ made and prayerfully reflect on what he's done for you, absolutely take part in it for what it is. It's not eating his body and drinking his blood, and that's not what he's referencing here.
Do this in remembrance of me.
Passover. So that particular idea is he is giving Passover when he does this ceremony. He is going through the three different pieces of bread that are in the Passover celebration, the three cups that he won't consume the last cup until the second coming. And so what he's saying is, as you do Passover, which Passover is a celebration of the sacrificial blood being a basis for salvation. That is what the Jews were saved by, putting blood on their doors, and that's the reason he was crucified in connection with Passover. And so he's saying, as you do Passover, as you observe Passover, do these things, I am a fulfillment of that prophecy. All of that was prophetic of me. Do this in remembrance of me. The Last Supper is a Passover Seder. It goes through each element of the Seder, and he's handing out the specific cup and says, take this cup. I am not trying to denigrate the practice of communion, because I think, like I said, it's what bad could there be in celebrating his death? But I can tell you from a biblical standpoint, he is referring to the practice of taking Passover. He gives each of the cups, and then he even says after that, I will not take the last cup until you. So it's the second cup, which is the cup of sacrifice, that he's holding when he says, drink this in remembrance of me. The first is sanctification, the second is sacrifice, and the third is celebration. And he says, I won't drink the cup of celebration until I come again and establish my kingdom. But he's holding the cup of sacrifice and says, when you do this in remembrance of me.
So the only challenge I have with that, and I really, really love thinking about it that way, and agree with you more than I disagree with you. But what about where it says, as often as you do it? Because the Passover was established as a practice at a set time of year. So then, why would you say as often as you do it if it wasn't supposed to become a symbolic practice?
I think it still is. I think it's just saying every year, just like we do, as you do Christmas.
As often as you do it, then. I mean, it would have been understood the frequency
Well,
with which you would do it.
So before, when they took the cup of sacrifice, they were looking backwards, and it was celebrating what Christ did for bringing the people out of captivity in Egypt. The whole Passover to the Jews was backwards looking and saying, God has brought us out of captivity, and it's backwards looking. He's saying, now, when you take Passover, I have brought you out of captivity. now this cup, which once reminded you of that, as often as you take Passover, do it in remembrance of me. I am the fulfillment of the prophetic aspect of Passover, that they have both every one of the feasts, and we did this whole study, it has a historical aspect where it's celebrating something that God did in the past, and they have a prophetic aspect of showing something he's going to do in his first or second coming. And Passover is very clearly all about his death and sacrifice and his blood being a propitiation for our sin. And so I think he's saying every year when you take Passover, just like you would say each year on my birthday, do a toast to me, like each year now when you take Passover, this is now a celebration of what I've done for you. And so that's why I think there's still tremendous value. If you want to do a Passover Seder every Sunday and celebrate I don't think that we're confined to the law. I don't think we're bound to do Passover in a ritualistic means. And so I think communion is perfectly permissible if you want to, in the right heart and with the right spiritual mindset, celebrate him every morning when you get up and break bread and say, Lord, I do this in remembrance of you. That's wonderful. I don't think he was instituting a new practice. I think he was very much identifying prophetically with what they were doing at the moment he was saying it. And I think
what we came up with doing it the first Sunday?
Council of Nicaea is going to be the answer to every one of those questions. There was literally a council of the church. Council of Omnia. Council of Nicaea was when they decided that Jews didn't need to become Christians, but then years later, the church got together in about 80 AD, and there was a very concentrated effort to delineate Christianity from Judaism. I mean, they basically outlawed Judaism and said that celebrating the feasts was punishable by death among Christians. And so then the Romans adopted this new form of very anti-Israel Christianity. The fact that Easter is on the day it's on, it's so that it can never fall on Saturday. It's very specifically can't fall on Passover. I could go for hours on the various things that they instituted to try to make sure that it was very un-Jewish and that we were different from the Jews. And part of that was practicality because the Jews had just been decimated in 70 AD. The Romans came in and killed every Jew in Israel and dispersed them to the wind. And so the Christians were trying to say, hey, we're not those guys. We're different. You don't need to kill us. And so there was some practical to it, but it's satanic to its core. Like that.
Because they killed the Christians in the Colosseum.
In the Colosseum, they were still persecuting Christians, but there was an edict in 70 AD, Titus Vespasian and the 10th, 12th, and 15th Legion went into Israel, and the emperor had said, as long as there is a Jew living in Israel, we will never have peace, and killed over 1 million Jews, and that's called the diaspora, the dispersion. And you've heard the horrific stories of the Romans stacking Jewish babies on a sword to see how many they could fit on a standard length sword, and it's the horrors that were in that time are unheard of. Like, it was a genocide. It was meant that no Jew would survive. And Masada was the Jewish fortress that was in the hills. The last remnants of the Jews locked themselves in there and had a mass suicide to prevent themselves from being taken by the Romans because of the atrocities they were committing. But a remnant, as always, dispersed, and that's what we call the diaspora, that they all left Israel. And so part of the practicality was there was a Roman edict that as long as there was a Jew in Israel, there will never be peace, and they were to kill all Jews. And so that's the first Holocaust of the Jews. In our modern time, there were plenty in the past, in biblical times, but 70 AD, that's the diaspora. Yep, and when Jesus is standing on the Temple Mount and says, because you didn't recognize this, your hour, that's a dramatic statement, that you not one stone will be left upon another, you will be dispersed. It was a judgment of God for missing. Daniel told him not only the time frame, but the very day on which the Messiah would be coming. And they didn't recognize this their hour, and that's why Jesus sits on the mountain and weeps and says, because you didn't recognize, you will be dispersed. He even used the word, you will be diaspora. You will be dispersed. And sure enough,
within a single lifetime of his death, they were dispersed. And it's a tragedy. It's horrible. But like the church very much made concerted efforts to make sure that we were different, both for practical reasons and reasons that still continue to really wreak havoc on our theology.
What was the excuse the Romans gave for wanting to get rid of the Jews?
Insurrection after insurrection after insurrection. The first one was in 20 BC, the Maccabean revolt, which was the basis of Hanukkah. They had thrown off the Roman yoke and revolted against the Romans, and that's the whole celebration of Hanukkah is after the Maccabees revolted against the Romans. There was hundreds of times in which they tried to gather and cast out the Romans, and so the Romans just got tired of it. And he said, as long as there's a Jew as long as there's a Jew in Israel, there can be no peace. And so, edict to just kill every living Jew in Israel, and that was, yeah. And some crazy stories come out of that. Jesus says, not one stone of the temple will be left standing on another. When Titus's 5th Legion came in through the western gates, they were trying to loot all the gold. The entire dome of the top of the temple was gold. And there were so many fires in the area that the heat of the Temple Mount area burned the dome. And this is in Herodotus. Burned the dome, and it melted down through the rocks in the wall, and so it melted in all the cracks and crevices. So they quite literally tore every single stone out of the temple to pull the gold out of the cracks. They were literally, for about 15 years, pulling every single stone. Not one stone was left standing on another. When you see the Wailing Wall, that's the area, that's not part of the temple, that's the support structure. It'd be like a retaining wall for landscaping that held the base of it. Every single stone in the temple was picked apart so that they could get the gold that had seeped down through the cracks. You're telling me that's just like, he literally said, what purpose would they have to destroy one of the great, they loved architecture. The Romans, their love of Greek architecture and historical preservation is known in every corner, yet they tore one of the most prolific buildings in the time down to the very basin, and because Christ said they would. That's a crazy fulfillment. I'm almost done here. I'm not going to read all this and leave it to you to read it, but one of the things I want to point out is, count how many times he says, I have it here in New King James, most assuredly. Only in John, he says, verily, verily, I say unto you. That is mark this. Get your highlighter out. This matters more than anything. He's going to say it 4 times here, and the next time he's going to use it is when he's giving the Last Supper. So he's saying, this is unless you consume me. The next time he's going to use verily, verily is going to be at the Last Supper. He's going to say it 3 times there. 7 times total. 4 times here, 3 times there. Surely coincidence, I'm sure, and they happen to be going to the same exact message, but again, it's just evidence of design that no one could possibly engineer from the outside. So we went through this, and I just gave the fastest one through. I put this in here because I think it is one of the most interesting prophetic statements in the Bible, and the fact that it just remains untranslated is wild to me. This is an untranslated passage. Proverbs 30 starts out, the words of Agur, the son of Jakeh, yea, the prophecy, that man spake unto Ithiel, even unto Ithiel and Ukal. What does that mean? Okay, what's wild is, I will tell you, this is a prophecy of exactly what Christ is talking about. Agur, we know. Solomon calls himself the collector. He calls himself the collector on several occasions. He calls himself a collector of dark sayings, or we would say deep sayings. That's what the book of Proverbs is his collection of deep sayings, of truths that require sussing out. And so in Ecclesiastes, he refers to himself as the preacher. And in Proverbs, he refers to himself on 4 different occasions as the collector. In each other instance, it's translated the collector. So the words of the collector, the words of Solomon, the son of Jakeh. Jakeh is the godly king. Who is the godly king? He's establishing who he is. It's David. It's Solomon, the son of David, right? The words of Agur, the words of the collector, the son of the godly king. Yea, the prophecy, that man spoke unto Ithiel, even Ithiel unto Ukal. If we remember, Emmanuel is God with us. Ithiel, right? We got that. That one's translated. Ithiel is God has come to us. And Ukal means to be consumed. So the prophecy so these are the words of Solomon, the son of David, that God has come down, God has come to us to be consumed. And then take some time and go through the rest of Proverbs 30. It is the messianic style of it is insane. And it starts off, surely I am more brutish than any man. And if you want to find an area to criticize the King James, this is what everybody quotes. It is the most absurd translation. Surely I am the most brutish, or I am more brutish than any man and not understanding of a man. I neither learned wisdom nor have the knowledge of the holy. What it's saying is, I am natural. I am the most natural. I am the most elemental of any man, and I don't need any man to teach me anything. I need not that anyone should teach me. I do not need the understanding of man. I am naturally, I know these things naturally. I don't need the understanding of any man. No one taught me wisdom, nor have they taught me knowledge of the holy. So it's saying, I am someone who knew all things. I had no need for anyone to teach me. And then it goes into a messianic psalm, and this is where we get, tell me who is this, the wind and the waves, and you go find that in
Take the water up in the cloak.
each one of them is a reference to a story that's in Job. Each one is messianic, and then it says, who is God, and tell me what is his son's name. And so it's this whole establishment that God is with us to be consumed. This person has all knowledge of God, needs nothing, and has all knowledge of the holy. Tell me, who is it that it's really, really cool to go track down each of the statements. And it even calls out, they talk about, well, God doesn't have a son. He sure does. I mean, if you're reading Proverbs, that's in your book. I mean, it says, tell me, who is his son? Right? As it's talking about a messianic prophecy, I think studying Proverbs 30 is absolutely awesome. It's really good. Nancy Missler has a whole thing on the Proverbs 30 path where she kind of, I don't know, it's probably a Chuck Missler thing because it's pretty geeky, but she uses this to dive into what does it mean to consume Christ, but she uses the Proverbs 30 platform. Really cool. Yeah.
We establish that it is us consuming Christ rather than God consuming us. He's a consuming fire, and he refines us as silver and gold.
It's just the language of this is that ukal is to be consumed, for the purpose of being consumed. It's just God is with us to be consumed. I mean, it's possible. It could be that he's the consuming fire. Have a good night. I think it's whatever it is, it's very clearly messianic, and I only put it out here because I think just getting into Proverbs 30 is so cool. Just to go through and trace each one of the references that it says. It's just these inane sayings that it's who is this? Who's the person who does that? Who's the person who does that? Who's the person who does that? And oh, by the way, who is the Lord, and what is his son's name? It's very much establishing, because each one of those, when it says, who is this? The Messiah, the Messiah, the Messiah. Who is God, and what is his son's name? It's very much a puzzle where you could just I love that one, and I think it's interesting that it ties in with this idea of consuming him. I'll pass through this. I put this as a highlighter. You get these radical statements, and I love the reaction of even the people that he's calling the disciples. So there's the crowds and multitudes. Then it says there are the disciples who heard him. And then it says there are the 12, right? So it's using this term disciples that he had more than just the 12. There were more people that were dedicated followers. Therefore, many of his disciples, when they heard these sayings, said, this is a hard saying. Who can understand it? I can sympathize with that. I like that reaction. But Jesus knew when Jesus knew in himself that his disciples complained about this, he said to them, does this offend you? What then if you should see the Son of Man ascend where he was before? What if I leave? What if I just ascended and I didn't fulfill all your expectations? It is spirit that gives life. The flesh profits nothing. The words that I speak to you are spirit and they are life. And that's what we pointed to, is he's calling on them to understand this bread of life concept. It's not about consuming his body. It's not about like a metaphor for how we take him in by eating or any of those weird things. They're references to actual things that the Jews should know about. What is the manna? What is the bread of life in the Old Testament? And I am all those things. Those all point to me, and I fulfill all of their attributes. From that time, many of his disciples went back and walked with him no more. Then Jesus said to the 12, do you also want to go away? But Simon Peter said, Lord, to whom shall we go? You have the words of eternal life. I love that in spite of the miracles, in spite of all, he's pointing to, you have the words of eternal life. Also, we have come to believe and know that you are the Messiah, the Son of the living God. And that is probably the high point in Peter's life. His profession. He's got another profession of faith where Christ changes his name, but Peter will constantly be saying dumb things, doing stupid stuff, talking before he thinks, and getting himself in trouble to the point of denying Christ out of fear. But this is the high point of his profession of faith. And Jesus answered them, did I not choose you, the 12? And one of you is a devil. He spoke of Judas Iscariot, the son of Simon, for it was he who would betray him, being one of the 12. So, yeah, I went into this. I didn't mean to give too much of the homework away. So maybe I'll just say, start with, like, we talked about Genesis, the bread of, like, I think it's absolutely pointed that in the Garden of Eden, when they were living off of provision from the land, there was no toiling, there was no farming, they didn't have to grow wheat or bake their own bread. It said everything they needed was provided until the curse. And in the curse, he says, now you shall eat bread by the sweat of your brow. I imagine Adam going, bread. Like,
How do you know they didn't provide bread for him?
sure, maybe there's manna, but it's not the same word for manna. It's not the what's it. And God never even
God walked with him in the garden. Who's to say the angels weren't there cooking dinner?
making it had an oven. No, it's possible. I think it's very important from a structural standpoint that even in that first curse, that bread is mentioned. That life will be through the sweat. That you will. It's going to be. It's a contrast of under the law you will labor for your salvation. It is a works-based, constant sacrifices, purification, maintaining your standing, and yet still having that faith until Christ. Then there's rest, right? Then once that bread is broken, it's no longer works. That idea that Adam had to find life by the sweat of his brow was from the first Adam until the last Adam, which is one of the many names of Christ. It is a prophetic fulfillment that until then, now the bread of life is freely given. It is once and for all. You don't collect it every day. It does not go away. Manna is only for Israel. It was not consumable by anyone else that was with them and not Israel. They didn't have food. You couldn't gather for anyone else. You could only gather for yourself. You couldn't store it up. It had to be in the moment. So you couldn't get provision for the next day. It was day-to-day living. Your life was sustained day-to-day by God. Christ, his bread of life, is a contrast to manna in that it is once and for all. It is no work. It is just eat, and there is nothing you could do to add to it. They are antithesis of each other. And so, yeah, it's very much prophetic fulfillment that from the first Adam to the last Adam, it was one way. Now it will be another. Yep.
Brad, on where it says, from that time, many of his disciples went back and walked with him no more. So isn't a disciple a believer?
Yeah, it uses.
So then they really, right?
Exactly. That's why I'm saying it's so hard to. You will not find. You won't find surety in the language. You won't find surety in what it says. Like, it would sure seem like those people believed. They followed him no more. But it also then says everyone who believes that God gave to him, that God called to him, he lost no one. Well, did they not have that next step that God called them? They were disciples in that they followed him and obeyed him for a time, but were not called of God and did not, right? Like if he wanted to make it easy, he could have made a light bulb go off the second your belief was sufficient to generate faith, to open the door for faith. And faith, once instilled, is once and for all. It is not taken away. He didn't do that. He very much made it like a pursuit. He wants you to be wrestling, and he doesn't say once you're saved, stop wrestling with it. As Deb was pointing out, the epistles constantly are encouraging us to pray for belief, was to pray for our belief to be expanded, that our faith may be made whole, that through faith we shall be purified and in likeness and likeness transformed into the image of the everlasting God. So it's that your belief grows, opening the door further for him to give you more faith. And as your faith grows, he purifies you. So he gives you the thing that causes you to grow. Then he does the purifying. And then once you're sufficiently pure, he rewards you for the work that he did in you. Like, it's bizarre. All you're doing is praying, help me believe more.
Is that what they call sanctification?
You got it. You got it. I mean, that's perfect. That's what we talked about in all of Romans, is this idea of you're being sanctified. You're being conformed into his image. He's doing everything, and all you're doing is throwing up your hands and saying, I submit. I live through me. Yes, Lord. And then just by saying every day, every minute, yes, Lord, you live through me, not only does he count that towards righteousness, he rewards you and improves you into greater levels of righteousness, and then in the end will actually reward you for your faithfulness. It's bizarre, but it's not something where you can just sit down and say, I saw at a football game a sign that said, for God so loved the world that whoever believes in him shall have everlasting life. I believe. Done. Like, you can't, please, I hope nobody rests on that as sufficient belief, because I got about 25 examples in here of it saying they were disciples of his, yet they believed no more, or they walked with him no more and were excluded. And he says God didn't call them. We have people that profess their faith. We have people performing miracles and casting out demons that he says it wasn't enough. Like, there is a reason these are in here, and it's because he wants to be pursued throughout your whole life. Not just pursue me until that light bulb goes off and you realize you have the belief that institutes faith. Now I'm saved. Okay, I don't need to pursue anymore. It is a relationship. You got married to Sam. It wasn't like, he believed in me enough to marry me. Now he can stop. You want it to be a pursuit throughout your whole life. And you'll stumble and you'll do it terribly. He won't. He'll do it perfectly. And all you have to do is be willing.
It's a natural thing to wrestle with it and pursue and want to please and fall short. And then
just like every relationship you've ever had. Like, our capacity to love and our desire to be loved is the only reflection we have of God. In every other way, we are completely different from him. In this one sliver, we have the capacity to love, and he is completely love. And so we can see a tiny bit of his character in us, just in how we experience love. The things that I want from my wife are the things that he wants from me. And if I shortchange my wife, she will know it. And I'm not going to fool God. If I shortchange him, he will know it. He wants to be pursued. And he wants all the things that I want out of marriage. I want to be respected and needed and like an integral part. He wants those too. He wants how I experience love is different from my wife. God experienced all of it. He wants to be pursued and cherished and loved. He also wants to be respected and save the day and needed, and like, we just get this tiny little glimpse of his heart just in how we experience it. But you're not going to fool him. You're not going to be like, yeah, I totally believe. I love you, God. I can't fool my wife. She knows when I'm full of crap, but I bet I can fool God. Like, come on. Like, yeah, it's a struggle. It's a pursuit.
make sure that you ask God, make sure that I'm not believing me.
Yeah.
And that's okay to pray that constantly and question that.
He loves,
Right?
yes, he loves the questioning. He loves the pursuit, just like you love when your spouse is, what is it you're wanting from me? Like, what can I do to please you? Like, am I pleasing you? You know, you're telling me when Sam's like, hey, how am I doing? Like, what can I be doing to please you? Like, how's my whatever? Because I desperately want to make you happy. Are you happy? I love you so much. Are you telling me you're like, ugh, you really shouldn't be questioning that. You should just know.
Yeah.
No, absolutely. He loves the wrestling. He called Jacob. Jacob was rewarded because he was one who wrestles with God. He wants you, like, going back and forth with, what do you need? Like, how can I please you more? David's constantly saying, search my heart, Lord. Find the wickedness in me. Show me how I can be more. And then because of that, God calls him, who is probably the worst human being since Cain, a man after his own heart. Because he wrestles with God. He deeply wants to please God. He's very aware of his failings. He's constantly just fast-paced, repentant when he sins. So I think the church wants you to be like, nope, you can have no doubts in God. It has no room for your doubts. That's fundamentally untrue. He wants you to bring your doubts to him. He wants you to, like, oh, Lord, show me, like, be real to me, like, be part of my life. Walk with me, talk with me. I'm struggling today, you know. Don't go to someone else. Go to me. Talk to me. I want to hear when you're struggling, you know, just like you do with your spouse. Don't go to your buddies and tell them you're having a bad day. Don't go to them and say you're struggling with, like, bad thoughts. I'm struggling with, like, lust and stuff. Come to me. Like, tell me. Let's talk about it. Let's be one. Let's, like, get through this together. That's all God's asking. It's the same thing you're asking of your spouse. That's the same thing you want from your kids. Don't go to someone else to solve your problems. Come to me. I love you. I want to help you solve them. I can. I'm all powerful. Come to me. Like, your problems are nothing to me. Quit going to, you know, whatever.
Self-help book.
Yeah, self-help book, therapy. Come to all those things are not. There's nothing wrong with them, but they're not God. He wants to be the thing. Just like you want that from your kids. You have the same glimpse of love. Like, you want them to come and say, save the day. Like, how can I? It's just very much the exact same thing, but we think we're unique, and then our relationship to God can be faked. Like, it can just be, it's a once and done. I said the prayer at one point, and that's good enough, but I expect more from the people who love me. Absolutely. I would not accept that. That's not love, right? But it's good enough for God. Scary, right? Like, that, it should cause you to be like, to fear God. There's a reason they're consistently admonished to fear God. Like, I want to always be worried about pleasing him the same way I fear my wife. I don't want her to leave me. It's not a fear like she's going to smite me, but like, I listen to her because I don't want to lose her. That's scary. I don't want her angry at me. That's scary. Like, I pursue her. I'm like, I don't want to lose whatever it is we have. And there's a fear there, and it's a very healthy fear. I hope she has that fear of losing me, and I hope, like, it causes you to act a certain way. So I have said way too much on this, probably for anyone's own good, but that's my biggest concern and, like, anxiety with the way the church portrays God is, yes, he is absolutely accessible. It is freely given. It is a taste and see. It is knock and the door will be opened. But it's going to cost you everything. It's not simple. It's not walking down the sawdust trail and one and done. It is a relationship. It is more. It's going to cost you more than any marriage. And we would never think marriage is just a walking down the aisle. It's a daily pursuit. But yet somehow the church constantly portrays our relationship with God as long as you said that prayer, as long as you acknowledge that he's God, you should be good. I don't think so. It wouldn't be good enough for me, and I'm pathetic. I'm nothing, and I'm nobody. He is the God of the universe, and we're saying it should be good enough for you? Come on, get real. I wouldn't accept it, and I didn't create you. Like, yeah. It'll cost you everything you have. It may not take it away, but you have to give it away still. Like, it's going to cost you everything you have. Either you give it freely. Doesn't necessarily mean you're going to be martyred, but you got to give it. Like, it's gonna cost you everything you have. And Jesus says that this is not simple. This is not, they're not, if they like you, you're doing something wrong. All these radical statements. But yeah. So, okay. Yes. Thank